January 3, 1961, 11:07 p.m., in a small apartment on the east side of Berlin, the faint hiss of a radio filled the dim room. Outside, the streets were quiet, the usual hum of post-industrial life softened by the winter chill. Karl Weber sat on a wooden chair, hunched forward, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He listened intently as the broadcast shifted between government announcements, coded political messages, and what seemed like ordinary news. But something about the cadence, the choice of words, made his chest tighten. Karl had always trusted information at face value. He read newspapers, followed radio broadcasts, and discussed politics casually with friends. But tonight, a subtle unease coiled inside him. The report mentioned an increase in security vigilance, yet no explanation was offered. A neighbor whispered about foreign agents in the city. Karl's mind automatically tried to categorize the threat: friend, enemy, rumor, truth. The distinction was becoming impossible to discern. He glanced at his wife, Ingrid, who was folding laundry quietly in the corner. She caught his eyes and raised a brow, a silent acknowledgement of the tension in the air. Their 10-year-old daughter, Lotta, played on the floor, unaware of the layers of invisible pressure swirling around the adults. Karl realized he had begun to feel something strange, not just fear of the world outside, but a creeping doubt in his own judgment. What could he trust? Who could he trust? The government didn't need to invade homes physically. It had learned that fear and uncertainty were far more potent tools. Through selective information, repetition, and the constant reminder of threats, some real, some exaggerated, some fabricated, it trained citizens to question not only the world but themselves. Karl noticed that every broadcast, every official message, seemed to linger longer than necessary, each word measured to provoke concern, attention, and compliance. He got up and paced the narrow hallway, tracing patterns in his mind like a chessboard of possible threats. The radio continued its cycle: crime reports, international tensions, a subtle warning about loyalty. Each segment embedded unease, teaching the mind to anticipate danger, doubt intentions, and internalize a sense of personal vulnerability. Fear was no longer episodic, it had become routine, a low hum behind every decision, every glance, every step. Karl sat back down, rubbing his temples. The realization hit him slowly, insidiously: the war being waged wasn't visible in streets or on maps. It was invisible, waged inside the human mind, and he was both target and participant. The CIA and KGB, he understood now, weren't just strategizing with spies and weapons, they were strategizing with thoughts, emotions, and perception itself. And for the first time, he wondered if he had ever truly been free. March 15, 1962, 6:12 a.m., Karl awoke to the faint chime of the city's church bells. The light was pale, filtered through frost on the windowpane, and the cold seeped into his bones despite the thick wool sweater he had pulled on. The apartment smelled of coffee and damp laundry, a normal morning in appearance, but his mind was already racing, scanning for anomalies. He felt a subtle tension in his jaw, a silent echo of the fear cultivated over months of careful messaging, propaganda, and unspoken warnings. Outside, people moved along the streets, some greeting each other warmly, others passing with neutral expressions. Karl's eyes followed a man who lingered too long near the bakery, cataloging him silently. He didn't know why, only that it felt necessary. The invisible lessons of the Cold War had taught him to watch, to anticipate, to doubt. Each movement, each conversation, carried potential significance. A rumor, a gesture, a glance could shift the balance between safety and perceived threat. At work, the patterns continued. Colleagues whispered about possible infiltrators and security breaches, careful to frame their words in hypotheticals. Karl noticed how people repeated phrases from official broadcasts, as though rehearsed scripts were now their way of thinking. Even casual remarks carried layers of caution. The mind had been trained to interpret intent, to read meaning where none may exist. Fear had become a discipline, a constant hum guiding decisions. At home, Ingrid moved quietly, checking the locks, ensuring curtains were drawn, glancing over her shoulder with habitual vigilance. Lotta, curious and playful, didn't notice any of it, but Karl realized the conditioning had begun to seep into the next generation. Practices meant to protect were shaping thought: obedience, attentiveness, self-restraint, and above all, distrust of anything outside the immediate sphere of authority. Karl began to understand that the power of this psychological warfare was subtle yet total. Unlike conventional weapons, it didn't destroy buildings or lives immediately. It reshaped reality itself. By controlling information, by sowing doubt, and by normalizing constant vigilance, the government had trained the mind to comply without coercion, to fear without visible cause, to internalize authority as instinct. That evening, Carl sat by the radio again, listening to a broadcast that emphasized vigilance, loyalty, and awareness of potential spies in every neighborhood. His stomach tightened, but he also noticed a strange clarity. The lesson was learned. He had absorbed it. Fear had become a tool, a lens through which he filtered all interactions, decisions, and judgments. It was efficient. It was invisible. And it was terrifyingly effective. As he turned off the radio and looked toward his sleeping family, Carl realized the invisible battlefield had no clear lines, no official ceasefire. Every thought, every glance, every choice was part of the ongoing war. The lesson was now encoded in his mind. Survival depended not only on actions, but on the control of perception itself. August 7, 1963, 10:18 p.m., Carl sat alone in his dimly lit study, the soft ticking of a clock punctuating the quiet. Outside, the city was shrouded in mist, streetlights reflecting off wet cobblestones. He clutched a newspaper, reading an article about a so-called espionage ring that had been discovered in another city. The story was filled with selective details, half-truths, and ominous suggestions, and yet it left him with a lingering unease he couldn't shake. The CIA and KGB didn't need to launch rockets to win influence, they manipulated perception. Every story, every bulletin, every leaked rumor was a thread in a web designed to make citizens doubt reality. Carl had become painfully aware of the subtle layers, a hint here, a statistic there, a narrative designed to provoke suspicion. It wasn't about the literal truth, it was about the mind's response to uncertainty. The more he tried to separate fact from fiction, the more entangled he became. At the market, conversations buzzed with cautious speculation. Shopkeepers spoke in hushed tones about recent events abroad. Neighbors passed warnings along, disclaiming their sources while reinforcing collective anxiety. Even casual interactions were charged with the invisible tension instilled by decades of psychological conditioning. Carl noticed that every word had a dual meaning now, and every statement required mental decoding. Trust had become a scarce commodity. At home, Ingrid sensed his increasing tension, though she never addressed it directly. The family had adapted to silent protocols, subtle cues, careful wording, measured movements. Carl realized that fear and uncertainty weren't just influencing behavior, they were reshaping relationships. Every glance, every phrase, even laughter, carried the potential for hidden meaning. The mind had become a battlefield, each thought a strategic decision between vigilance and vulnerability. Carl began keeping notes, recording incidents that seemed to blend rumor with reality. The exercise gave him a strange sense of control, a way to map the invisible influence of misinformation on his own mind. Yet he also recognized its insidious power, it had become automatic. He noticed his reactions, his assumptions, his anticipatory calculations, all guided by forces he couldn't see and couldn't name. The most unsettling moment came one evening when he realized his doubts had extended inward. The training worked so well that he now questioned his own instincts, second-guessing decisions and perceptions that had previously felt natural. Fear, once external, had been internalized. The battlefield wasn't just society, it was Carl himself, his thoughts, his judgments, his perceptions. The machinery of misinformation was complete. It didn't require force, punishment, or even visibility. It existed as a subtle, persistent shaping of the mind, teaching obedience, vigilance, and distrust without overt coercion. And Carl, like countless others, was living proof of its success, careful, alert, and endlessly uncertain. February 19, 1965, 5:47 a.m., Carl sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steaming cup of coffee in front of him. The frost on the window blurred the city outside, giving it a ghostly, uncertain quality. Even in the quiet of his own home, he felt tension coil in his chest. The drills, the rumors, the subtle lessons of surveillance and obedience were no longer just occasional reminders, they had become a framework for daily life. Every action, every decision carried the weight of potential consequences. At work, Carl noticed the ripple effect of this constant vigilance. Colleagues hesitated to voice opinions, measured their expressions, and paused every sentence for hidden meanings. Meetings that should have been routine felt like strategic exercises in decoding intentions. Carl found himself second-guessing not only others, but also his own reactions. Trust was a currency in short supply, and every interaction demanded careful calculation. At home, the vigilance continued, but now it was intertwined with habit. Ingrid methodically checked doors and windows each evening, while Carl reviewed the day's news with a scrutinizing eye. Lotta, unaware of the hidden pressures shaping her parents, played quietly on the floor, yet even her innocent questions prompted subtle mental evaluations. The entire household had adapted, living as if they were constantly under observation, by the state, by neighbors, by each other. Carl realized that this disciplined fear, once a tool for survival, had begun to restrict life itself. Every thought and action was filtered, analyzed, and weighed. The mental energy spent on preparedness and suspicion left little room for spontaneity, joy, or emotional intimacy. Even small moments of peace were tainted by the awareness that the world could shift in an instant, that control was an illusion maintained only through constant attentiveness. Yet paradoxically, this constant vigilance brought a kind of clarity. Carl knew the rules of engagement in this invisible battlefield. He could anticipate reactions, predict behaviors, and navigate social interactions with precision. The mind, conditioned by fear and uncertainty, had become sharp, responsive, and highly disciplined. But the cost was subtle and cumulative: quiet exhaustion, emotional restraint, and the slow erosion of natural trust. That evening, Carl sat by the window, listening to the faint hum of the city. The cold light reflected off the snow, and for a moment he allowed himself to breathe without planning, calculating, or scanning for threats. It was uncomfortable, his instincts resisted this stillness, but it offered a glimpse of a life not entirely controlled by fear. He realized that the Cold War's most powerful weapon wasn't nuclear missiles or espionage, it was the ability to occupy the mind continuously, silently, and invisibly. Carl understood something essential: surviving this psychological war required more than vigilance. It required awareness, reflection, and eventually, the courage to reclaim mental space from the very fear that had trained him to obey. June 9, 1967, 9:11 p.m., Carl sat in his study, the lamp casting a warm, flickering glow across stacks of newspapers and government pamphlets. He rubbed his temples, feeling the subtle ache of tension that had become a permanent fixture in his mind. For the first time, he began to ask a dangerous question: have I learned survival, or have I simply been trained to obey? The question gnawed at him. Years of vigilance, rehearsed routines, and measured words had made him cautious, disciplined, and attentive, but also constrained, anxious, and perpetually alert. The drills, propaganda broadcasts, and selective misinformation hadn't just taught him how to survive a nuclear threat, they had shaped how he thought, how he felt, and even how he judged himself. Fear had become second nature, a lens through which every interaction was filtered. At work, Carl noticed the same patterns repeating in others. His colleagues, too, moved through life like chess pieces, cautious, calculated, wary. Some had learned to thrive in this environment of doubt and surveillance. Others, like him, carried the hidden weight of constant mental tension. He realized that the government strategy had succeeded not just in controlling action, but in shaping thought, embedding doubt, and normalizing suspicion as instinct. At home, the question lingered. Ingrid noticed his contemplative silence and asked if he was all right. Carl paused before answering, aware that even this exchange had been influenced by years of subtle psychological conditioning. Could he trust his instincts? Could he trust his perception of reality, or had the invisible lessons of fear already rewritten his mind? The awareness was both unsettling and liberating. He began small experiments, allowing uncertainty to exist without immediately acting, observing his reactions without judgment, questioning assumptions that he had once accepted as truth. Each act was a minor rebellion against the invisible control that had governed his thoughts for years. Slowly, he learned that choice existed even within a system designed to eliminate it. Carl realized that survival wasn't enough. Living fully, thinking independently, and reclaiming mental autonomy required conscious effort. The fear, the doubt, the misinformation, they had been effective weapons, but they were not infallible. Awareness could interrupt the automatic patterns the government had worked so hard to instill. As he closed the lamp and prepared for bed, Carl allowed himself a rare thought: perhaps mastery over the mind was possible. Perhaps vigilance could coexist with freedom, preparation with peace, and caution with trust. The journey ahead would be slow, deliberate, and sometimes painful, but for the first time, he glimpsed a path not dictated by fear, but by choice. October 22, 1970, 7:05 a.m., Carl stood at the edge of a quiet park, the morning mist curling around the trees. The city was waking up slowly, footsteps on wet cobblestones, distant trams clanging, the smell of bread from a nearby bakery. For a moment, he simply breathed, allowing the sounds, smells, and sensations to exist without scanning for danger or reading hidden meaning into every movement. It was a strange freedom, unfamiliar yet deeply welcome. Over the past years, Carl had practiced reclaiming thought, testing the boundaries of the fear-conditioned mind. He had allowed moments of uncertainty without reaction, questioned assumptions, and observed his impulses before yielding to them. The habits of the Cold War, the drills, the silent warnings, the undercurrents of mistrust, still lingered, but he had begun to separate instinct from control. Fear no longer commanded his mind, it informed him, and only when he chose to let it. At work, he noticed a subtle shift in interactions. Meetings flowed more naturally. Conversations were less strategic, more genuine. Colleagues responded to his calm presence, and he felt a quiet authority that came not from manipulation or control, but from self-mastery. The training that once served only to heighten suspicion now allowed him to read situations clearly, anticipate outcomes thoughtfully, and act with intentionality rather than anxiety. At home, Carl observed similar changes. Conversations with Ingrid became more open, free from layers of mental calculation. He laughed more easily with Lotta, listened more fully, and allowed spontaneity to enter routines that had long been dominated by fear and caution. The house, once quietly tense, began to breathe again. Carl recognized that emotional and mental freedom required conscious effort, patience, and deliberate practice. One evening, as he wrote in his journal, Carl reflected on the journey. The Cold War had trained his mind, instilled discipline, and sharpened awareness, but it had also taught him the fragility of mental autonomy. Now, the same mind that had been molded by fear was reclaiming itself through observation, reflection, and choice. He understood that mastery was not the absence of fear, but the ability to coexist with it without surrender. As he closed the journal and looked out the window at the fading sunset, Carl felt a quiet sense of empowerment. The invisible battle had been fought not with bombs or spies, but in the human mind, and now, he had begun to win it from within. Survival had been the first lesson. Now, living fully, with awareness and freedom, was the true victory. March 3, 1973, 8:33 p.m., Carl sat on the balcony of his apartment, the city lights flickering through a thin evening haze. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, and the faint murmur of neighbors felt ordinary, almost comforting. He took a slow breath, letting the rhythms of life fill him without analyzing or anticipating them. For the first time in over a decade, he realized he could experience reality without the constant filter of fear. The lessons of the Cold War were still present, but their grip had loosened. Carl understood how governments had weaponized fear, doubt, and misinformation to shape thought, control behavior, and normalize suspicion. He had been a willing participant at times, internalizing caution and vigilance. Yet through reflection, patience, and deliberate practice, he had begun to reclaim agency over his own mind. At work, Carl found clarity replacing tension. He no longer interpreted minor events as hidden threats, and he could engage with colleagues without the constant undercurrent of doubt. Decisions were made with careful consideration rather than automatic suspicion. He noticed a newfound mental energy, freed from the invisible labor of continuous surveillance and hypervigilance. At home, the transformation was just as evident. Conversations flowed naturally, laughter returned, and small disagreements were navigated without underlying fear. Lotta, observing her father's steadier presence, seemed freer too, less influenced by tension, more open to exploration and play. Ingrid smiled knowingly, recognizing that Carl's subtle shift in perception had reshaped the household atmosphere. Carl reflected on the broader implications. The Cold War had been fought not only in cities, borders, and international policy, but in minds. Psychological warfare had trained populations to respond automatically to fear, to doubt their own judgments, and to defer autonomy in favor of obedience. Understanding this, Carl realized, was both terrifying and liberating. Awareness dismantled invisible chains. Choice replaced instinctive compliance. As he watched the sun disappear beneath the horizon, Carl allowed himself a rare thought: he had survived more than a geopolitical conflict. He had survived the silent war for the mind. And now, armed with insight, reflection, and intentionality, he could begin to live on his own terms, applying vigilance without surrender, caution without paranoia, and awareness without fear. The invisible battlefield remained, but Carl had found clarity. Fear could inform him, but it no longer controlled him. Survival had been taught, mastery had been chosen. October 11, 1976, 7:48 p.m., Carl stood in front of a small group at a community center, the dim light of the lecture hall casting soft shadows on the walls. Around him, faces of varied ages reflected curiosity, skepticism, and a subtle tension, echoes of the same conditioning he had lived under for years. He cleared his throat and began to speak, not of politics or ideology, but of the mind itself, how fear could shape perception, how doubt could manipulate behavior, and how awareness could reclaim control. As he spoke, Carl noticed the impact immediately. Eyes widened as attendees recognized patterns in their own lives, habits of thought influenced by invisible forces, small but persistent manipulations of trust and perception. He shared practical steps: pause before reacting, observe thoughts without judgment, question assumptions, and allow uncertainty to exist without surrender. Each principle resonated like a small key unlocking mental freedom. He told stories from his own life: the constant vigilance, the drilled routines, the subtle fear that governed even quiet evenings at home. The audience leaned in, captivated not by historical facts alone, but by the lived experience of someone who had walked the line between fear and autonomy. The Cold War had trained minds, he explained, but awareness and conscious reflection could retrain them. Back at home, Ingrid observed the change in him. Teaching these lessons reinforced his own growth. The mental exercises of observation and reflection, once solitary acts of self-preservation, had become tools to guide others. Lotta, older now and more perceptive, noticed her father's steadiness, his calm presence, and began to model it in her own responses. The household felt lighter, freer, a ripple effect of conscious mastery replacing inherited fear. Carl reflected on the paradox: the very system that had sought to control minds had inadvertently taught him the value of awareness. Understanding how fear had been used to manipulate thought allowed him not only to reclaim his own autonomy, but also to guide others toward mental clarity. The battlefield was still there in society, subtle and invisible, but awareness had become a weapon of liberation. As he closed the community center that evening and stepped into the crisp night air, Carl breathed deeply. The lessons were clear: survival required vigilance, but life required reflection. Fear could inform, but it should never dominate, and the mind, once trained by control, could always be retrained by choice. The invisible war had been relentless, but now, for the first time, Carl felt fully in command of his own thoughts. May 5, 1980, 6:22 a.m., Carl stood at the edge of a quiet lake just outside the city, the surface glassy and still, reflecting the soft pink of dawn. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. He inhaled slowly, allowing the calm to seep into his bones. For decades, his mind had been trained to anticipate danger, to question every shadow, to weigh every decision under the invisible hand of fear. Now, he was beginning to understand that the mind could exist beyond that conditioning. The lessons of vigilance still lingered, embedded like faint grooves in thought and behavior. But Carl had learned to separate instinct from influence, survival from surrender. He could recognize the subtle prompts of fear and decide whether to act on them or simply observe. Each choice to step back, each moment of mindful presence, reinforced his autonomy. Fear no longer commanded him, it informed him, like a tool rather than a master. At home, Carl's transformation rippled outward. Conversations with Ingrid became richer, more open, less constrained by habitual caution. Lotta, now a teenager, displayed a confidence in judgment and perception that Carl recognized as a product of both example and environment. The household was no longer a theater of silent vigilance, but a space where awareness, choice, and calm coexisted with the lessons of the past. He reflected on the broader implications of his journey. The Cold War had not only tested governments, armies, and nations, it had tested minds. Psychological warfare had been the invisible front, where control over thought was far more powerful than control over territory. Yet, Carl realized, the same mind that could be molded by fear could also be reclaimed by conscious reflection, deliberate choice, and awareness. Carl dipped his fingers into the cool water and watched ripples expand outward. The metaphor struck him: fear might have shaped the contours of thought like the shoreline, but clarity, reflection, and conscious action could extend outward like the ripples, influencing not just one life, but entire households, communities, and generations. As the sun climbed higher, casting warm light across the lake, Carl felt a profound sense of freedom. He had survived the subtle battles waged on the mind, but more importantly, he had mastered them. The invisible war had been relentless, but awareness, patience, and choice had proven stronger than fear. He smiled faintly, knowing that while the Cold War had trained the human mind could always be retrained to live fully, freely, and intentionally.